Okay.
All right. Good morning, Doug. Today we have lots of random issues to talk about. So I think starting with the fact that yesterday was a holiday in the U.S., Memorial Day, and I was you said before the weekend, you're like, oh, it's Labor Day, isn't it? And I said, no, Doug, it's very important. It's Memorial Day. We got to remember, you got to keep your federal holidays straight. But one of the interesting things about it is that, Memorial Day, and I as a former member of the military, I have lots of military friends, and I like it. I think the military is not a bad institution, although it's being corrupted pretty severely right now, it seems. The problem I have with Memorial Day is that we're really celebrating the day that we send our young men and women to die for bankers and military industrial complex and, missions to, as I guess Biden says, to spread democracy, which doesn't seem like that's a worthwhile pursuit either. But what are your thoughts on the holiday?
Well, I certainly agree with you. And perhaps I should have researched this a bit, but when did this holiday start? Didn't it first have something to do with the end of World War I on November 11th? And how did it migrate to the end of May, which more or less coincides with the beginning of summer in most of North America? It's when the pools open, for instance, in public places and so forth.
No, actually, I think that it was originally called Decoration Day, wasn't it? And it was following the Civil War.
Ah, okay. All right. Well, in any event, war is the health of the state, and wars rarely ever accomplish anything. And of course, let me catch you. I often have to catch myself. It's that you said the Civil War. And that's a great misnomer because
I was reading it. It was
okay. Right. Yeah, it's a huge mistake to call it the Civil War. In fact, I may not be going far enough when I call it the war between the states. And sometimes I'm corrected by other friends and say, no, you should really call it the War of Northern Aggression. And they're actually quite correct because, I think we've covered this in the past, but it kind of relates to all this stuff. It's that everybody, the reigning meme in the US is that the so-called Civil War was about setting the slaves free, but that's a complete and total lie. Slavery was a point of contention all through the country, in the South, the North, but it wasn't the cause of the Civil War. Insofar as slavery had anything to do with it, it was the extension of whether slavery should be extended into new territories that were going to join the US. That was the political issue that they were fighting out. It wasn't about freeing the slaves. Most people believed then, more in the North than the South, just because you tend to believe whatever people around you believe in whatever place you're born, not for any great moral reasons. So it wasn't about slavery. It was actually an economic issue. And nobody ever talks about this, that the fact that before the so-called Civil War, just about the sole source of income for the US government was import duties. That was it. And the government was very small, and import duties were sufficient. But import duties were very high. And I'm trying to remember the details because they're actually quite interesting. That the South paid paid about 3/4 of the import duties to the US. Why? Because they didn't have much industry, so they imported European goods, which were generally lower cost and higher quality than those manufactured in the North. And of course, the North benefited because most of those import duties were, insofar as the US government spent anything, were allocated towards things in the North. But there was, it wasn't a question of how the money was spent so much, because it was a trivial amount of money just to run a small U.S. government, but it was a question of who paid it. And the South paid about 3/4 of these import duties, which ran 25 to 50%. So it was substantial. And of course, if the South was not buying manufactured goods from Europe, that meant that the Europeans were less inclined to buy tobacco and cotton from the South. Well, it was the best place for them to buy, so that wasn't a good thing. But the South was paying all these duties, and the North wanted to raise them even further. And the reason the North wanted to raise them further is they were thinking, well, the South will then buy manufactured goods from us instead of the Europeans. So that was basically the cause of the war. And of course, there was a lot of argument about the efficacy and the morality of slavery, but most people are unaware of the fact that slavery had only been recently gotten rid of in all the other civilized countries of the world. Like, well, in South America, only like 30 years before, and in Europe, 50, 60 years before. And the last major country to have gotten rid of slavery was Brazil in 1888. But interestingly, talk about slavery, the last country to have gotten rid of slavery officially in the world, this is a fun fact for trivia. Do you happen to know what it is?
No idea.
I happen to know because 5 years ago, roughly, I spent a week there in Mauritania, where slavery had only been abolished in 1985.
What?
And even though it had been officially abolished in Mauritania, still, I went several places in that. It's a large country, desert country. Most people don't even know where it is. It's south of Morocco and north of Senegal on the west coast of Africa. And even today, it was obvious to me that the blacks were serving the Arabs, they were ex-slaves and still acting like slaves. So still exists. I mean, just not officially. So anyway, the Civil War was not about freeing the slaves. And Lincoln was a criminal, and he started the war. He fomented it with the South, and the South fell into the trap stupidly by attacking Fort Sumter. They should have just let it sit there and rot. But, you know, they were proud people, so they felt like they had to evict those damn Yankees. And that was a big mistake, because they never could have won the war. It was impossible. So anyway, Civil War.
Are all wars fundamentally economic, Doug?
Say again?
Are all wars fundamentally economic?
I'm not sure all of them are, because I think in the days of when rulers actually owned the country, the days of princes and kings and such, a lot of it was personal grudges and arrogance and on the part of the rulers. So,
but there was also the economic upside. If you conquered them, you would take the spoils of war, right? I mean, that had to be a big incentive for if you felt like you could win.
Yeah, war could be a profitable enterprise in those days, because when you conquered a country, you could steal all of its cattle, all of its gold, all of its artwork, steal the women, enslave the men who had high market value, slaves did. So yeah, it could be a profitable undertaking, actually, in those days. But now, the nature of the way economies run has changed so much that I don't think war can ever be profitable, frankly. It'll bankrupt both the victor and the loser.
Yeah, that's true. But don't you think, but when it's with like the war of northern aggression, it does seem like that was fundamentally a trade war first. And then because of it started off as a trade war where, you know, the North is essentially imposing sanctions on the South by having these high tariffs, you know, the South is like, forget it, we're done with it. Like that story sounds familiar. I mean, it sounds like I mean, wasn't it a similar situation with the Japanese and entering World War II, going after the Americans? Didn't we like cut them off from oil or threaten to cut them off from oil and impose?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what happened. I mean, the Japanese don't produce any oil, and at that time, China didn't produce any oil. And of course, they had their own war of aggression against the Chinese. So the U.S. Basically placed an embargo on shipping oil to the Japanese because most of their oil came from the U.S. And at that point, what were the Japanese supposed to do? Well, if they were smart, they would have backed down from their war of aggression against China. But instead, they ramped it up and felt they needed to attack the fleet at Pearl Harbor in order to take the assets of the Dutch Empire in Indonesia, which is where oil in that part of the world was being produced at the time. So yeah, that was economic. And the Japanese just made a foolish error.
That they did in the end proved to be true, but very costly for everyone involved along the way. And you got to wonder if those, forcing those economic sanctions on another country where you're basically trying to control and limit them and making them feel, threatened. Because if you're willing to attack a country or a state on an economic basis, it's not fundamentally different than attacking them on a physical basis. You know what I mean? It really does affect the livelihood and their ability to even survive, you would think. And so, it is dangerous anytime you go down that road.
It is. And actually, World War I is perhaps a bit more complex as far as how it started. But World War II also had its beginnings with the reparations that were imposed on Germany after World War I. Right. And the Germans were, I think, quite rightfully resentful about that because World War I is blamed on the Germans, but in fact, you could blame it on the British as much as you could the Germans, because the Germans were the rising power, and they were afraid that the Germans were going to eat their lunch. And they were kind of looking for an excuse before the Germans got more powerful economically and militarily both.
Yep.
So that was an element. Yeah, economics is, I guess there's two things that rule the world. One is economics and the other is psychology. And both of them have an element in wars, and I don't know what else does.
So the psychological component in these wars is what, in all the things we discussed, whether it be the War of Northern Aggression, World War I or World War II. We talked about the economic elements in some of those. What's the psychological drive that allowed those to come into being?
Well, I think in the unpleasantness of 1861 to 1865, the Southerners really and justifiably didn't want to be played for suckers, which is what the North was doing to them. Just kind of was really holding them down and reducing their standard of living, but they didn't want to be played for suckers, where the North was. And of course, this whole thing about expanding slavery into new territories, if slavery didn't expand into the new territories, then the South would have lost control of the Congress, and the North would have been able to make laws to their benefit and against the South's benefit. So that was also an element. But slavery had absolutely nothing to do with it. People forget that the Emancipation Proclamation only came out in 1860. Was it 1863 or late in 1862? Can't remember. Doesn't matter, actually. And yes, it freed the slaves, but it only freed the slaves in the South. It didn't even free the slaves in border states like Maryland and Tennessee and Missouri was that? I mean, it didn't free the slaves there because Lincoln was trying to create a slave rebellion to help bring down the South and didn't want to antagonize people that were slave owners in the North, for that matter. There were still slaves in Washington, D.C. during the war. So this whole thing is all about lies, like most wars. They say in war, truth is the first casualty, and absolutely true in the War of Northern Aggression.
Yeah, and it's a good
every other war, I think.
Yeah, it seems so. Like we have to, just like humans are so simple-minded. We want things to be that this is good and that is bad, and we want everything down to this binary, very simple issue. You know, and like the national story in the U.S. is that, you know, our great sin was slavery. This is the basic narrative now. Our great sin was slavery, and yet, but we came to terms with it. We fought a war over it. We had the highest casualties of all of our wars put together in it. And we, you know, through great suffering, we put that behind us, you know, and that's the story. It's just like, you know, we committed a sin, we recognized the sin, we righted the sin, and now, you know, we could put it behind us. At least that's what it was before the wokesters took over. But that narrative fundamentally is probably healthy for the country actually to believe it in many ways though, right? I mean, because if you believe that thing was bad and you believe that you reconcile with that thing and now it's over, even though it's not actually what actually happened, it is maybe it's a binding narrative that's useful for the country, at least. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, you know, the question is should Lincoln's thing, you know, he said this in many speeches, including his inaugural address. He says that slavery is not the issue. He preferred to see it go away. He felt that from a moral point of view, But
he also wanted to send all the Africans back. He wanted to send them all back to Africa.
Yes, he did actually, and that's what Liberia was all about. But
it's not like he was not racist.
No, everybody was racist then, and actually everybody is still racist today. Something that people forget, and it's just naturally bred into human beings to be racist because, you know, people outside my family, let's be a little suspicious of them. Outside my clan, definitely. Outside my tribe, they're the enemy, especially if they look different or dress different or talk different. You know, they're competing for that, you know, that herd of buffalo or whatever it is that we're hunting. So, I mean, let's wipe them out if we possibly can. They're a threat to us, indirectly, if not directly. So yeah, everybody is racist. And it's, you know, we can say it's morally indefensible. Okay, we can say that. And, you know, it's certainly unsavory and unseemly, but, you know, you're not going to wipe out racism. It's a genetic thing. The best you can do is, you know, try to treat people as individuals as opposed to members of groups.
Right.
But the state is the worst thing possible to use to try to wipe out racism. It's the cause of most conflicts in the world today.
I agree. And I think, especially what people don't realize is that, you know, even the Jim Crow era within the South, you know, that was the Jim Crow era existed because of the state mandated segregation of people. It wasn't that citizens themselves were doing it, or, you know, a business owner who had a lunch counter actually, you know, it probably was uneconomical for them. It certainly was uneconomical for them to have separate areas for different races, but they were required to by the state to do it. So the state, by state power, they enforced this racism, this institutionalized racism, and it couldn't be possible without the state.
Yes, absolutely correct. And look, as far as what happened in the South, you know, my opinion, having lived in the South as well as the North when I was growing up, my opinion is that race relations were better in the South in the old days, in the 50s, than they were in the North, quite frankly. I mean, and if it's true, and it's true, that a restaurant owner didn't want blacks to be seated in his restaurant, okay. I mean, I think that's stupid on his part, and you know, shows a moral failing on his part, both. So, but hey, it's his restaurant, it's his property. he can keep out everybody if he wants. You
Yeah.
know, any reason at all. I mean, it's going to damage his business, and the market will punish him. But
Like,
it's not something for the state to get involved in.
Exactly. But the state was involved, requiring them to, have separate areas for blacks and whites within the restaurant. The state forced every restaurant down there to do that, to be conducted that way. So,
and the same with public drinking fountains, which were put in by the state in tandem, one for each race.
Yeah, exactly. So the state, I think what people often, I think obviously these racist behaviors are clearly a moral failing, no doubt about it. But when they become incredibly dangerous, when they are institutionalized by the state, when they're by the power of punishment that or violence, that the monopoly on violence that the state has is supporting racism, like how the society is, it's really bad for everybody. It's really bad. And I think, but the problem is the scary things, we're going back to that now. We're going back to a form now.
We are. It's going into reverse, which is really dangerous, because in 20 years, the US will be half people of color and half white. And that makes it a potentially really explosive situation, especially when there are all these laws favoring people of color. And there are many laws being passed all the time and actions being taken that may not be laws, but they're definitely happening, that are now discriminating against whites and especially against white males.
Right. And I mean, if you have all these, if you have this historical grievance of minorities that were, disadvantaged in the US for a long time, by reversing that, what do they expect happens? I mean, how do they expect that to work out? And I really think that they, I saw this tweet the other day from somebody who's running for Congress as a Democrat, and it said, fact, if we eliminated all Republican voters, then in 10 years, we would have new highway systems, we'd have free health care, and we'd have, free university education. And it's like, that attitude is terrifying to me. The idea that if we just eliminated these people, then all of a sudden our problems would be solved. I mean, that sounds like something that Hitler would have said in the early stages. If we just move these Jews into the ghetto,
right,
then we'll be fine. Like, imagine what's possible. Anything's possible if you just push the Jews aside. It's scary. Yeah. It's scary.
Well, it's everywhere. I was reading a review in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend. It was a book on the African contribution to European civilization. Now, there have been real African contributions to American civilization in lots of ways, music and sports and so forth. But this foolish book, was trying to make the case that there was a major contribution by Africans to European civilization. And the reviewer, of course, the writer of the book was a Black professor, and the reviewer was another Black professor. And, they tried to make the case, the reviewer did, talking about this book, that Africans made a contribution to European music. It's completely ridiculous. Beethoven, Bach, Haydn, Wagner, and 50 other important composers, there was zero Black contribution to Europe, but they try to make that case. Huh. So it's all stupid racism on these people's parts.
It really is. I mean, I don't understand why they need to contrive a contribution there when there clearly is contribution elsewhere. Like, I don't understand why.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, there's a movement that says that the Egyptians were Black. Untrue. They're the same genetic stock as Egyptians are today, and that even the Greeks were Black, but because Socrates is always portrayed as having a broad nose. I mean, it just goes on and on. So the situation is completely hopeless.
Well, and why this obsession with race and trying to, it's like the obsession with the race to try and find this history to take to culturally appropriate, essentially, the contributions to society for under a guise of a certain race is fundamentally what racism is. It's that we need credit for this. Like, I don't feel like I'm advantaged because Socrates was, white, and whatever that really even means, non-black, whatever. I don't feel like that benefits me at all as a white person, for that to be the case, or that somehow, because of that heritage of Socrates being, whatever, that would somehow make, my race's contribution to the world somehow better. Like, I just think it's like, he was a dude who was wise and did wise things and happened to be recorded in history, and we are all advantaged because of it. I don't know why people have to see it as have to say, well, no, he was actually part of my tribe, not yours, so you can piss off.
Yeah, it's genetic. I mean, it was a survival characteristic in primeval times,
but now
to be racist against other groups. We're hardwired that way.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I still don't understand why it's now, though. But so just some other random things that came up over the weekend that are worth talking about, I guess, a little, is some international things. You sent me a couple of articles. One was on the Germans agreeing to reparations to Namibia, and another one was on remittances globally. And
yes.
What was it about these articles that stood out to you? And was there some relationship between the two of them that you thought was interesting?
Well, as far as the remittances are concerned, a major source of income for lots of poor third world countries are remittances, where members of the family will go to an advanced country and send back most of their earnings to the home country to keep the family and sometimes friends alive. Okay. And I guess my point on that was that when the economy collapses, and I believe it's going to be catastrophic, we'll see if I'm right or wrong, in the next little while, actually, a lot of these low-skilled workers will lose their jobs and won't be able to send money back home. And Haiti is a major recipient of remittances, but there are lots of countries. I mean, we might turn out wanting to make, I mean, I think it'd be idiotic, but who knows? After DC and Puerto Rico, maybe Haiti will become the 51st state, because there are about 13 million people in Haiti now. I think that's the accurate number. About 2 million of them are already physically in the US working, and lots more everywhere. It's a gigantic Haitian diaspora going on. So when that diaspora can't, and Haiti itself produces nothing. They produce Barbancourt rum, and that's it. I mean, they can't even grow stuff in that country because there are no property rights. It's chaos. It's a nightmare. So what's going to happen in Haiti? Well, these people are going to pile out of there to go someplace else, and they're going to riot, and it'll be really ugly. Same thing will have Egypt. That's another country with lots and lots of remittances. The economy gets bad. Traffic on the Suez Canal, major source of income for Egypt, that drops. This is
so if
tourism will drop, which is another major Egyptian source of income. So this is going to happen in lots of places like that. So it's going to be chaos, and it's going to be mass migration. And wasn't that one of the things that Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum were talking about? There will be billions of migrants in the world. This is one of their predictions for the next decade. He's right.
That's right. And these you're right. If the economy, if their income drops in the rich countries, in the Western nations that basically where these people work, then remittances collapse, and it's a huge portion of the economy in lots of second and third world countries. So, I mean, you mentioned two of them, but I mean, it's a huge thing in Mexico. Remittances are enormous into Mexico and all over South America. The Philippines is a huge one. I mean, it's everywhere. And so imagine if those get cut off, even if the economy is suffering here, the experience is probably much more acute in these second and third world nations that rely so heavily on these remittances, that you would see flashpoints there before here, even when the economy goes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought that was very interesting because combined with the drop in remittances as the economy goes down, which is what that article was about, they were pointing that out, it's that basic food prices, basic commodities, wheat, corn, soybeans, have been going through the roof. They're hitting the highs now that they hit last in 2011, which, not coincidentally, incidentally, is when the Arab Spring and all the Arabs were rioting against their governments because they blamed it on their governments, which they should in a way, but that's indirectly. They think like the government's a cornucopia and it's the government's fault that wheat prices have gone up. It goes much deeper than that. So
yeah, it's like the government's just holding out on them. That's the only problem.
Yeah, exactly. That's the only problem. Right. So anyway, I thought that was one interesting news item that kind of relates to what's going on.
Actually, before we do that, because it relates to the food prices, I wanted to see if you had heard about this JBS, this meat packer that has this cyber attack thing going on now and had to shut down their meat processing in Australia and all of North America. Did you hear this story at all?
Well, I probably should have because I'm involved in the commodities markets and I have been long hogs and I'm looking to go long cattle at this point. So, but there's so many news things, you can't keep up with it all. Tell me about it.
So basically they're one of the largest in the world, JBS is, and they're essentially a choke point in the supply chain for all meat processing. And they do mostly beef, but they have some cattle and even some salmon in Canada they do. And anyway, their plants were shut down. They shut down all of them yesterday. They can't, and they're still down today. And they say it's related to a cyber attack. The thing is, it's crazy how fragile everything is. But so the interesting thing is that, the prices on cattle went down, are down a bit now because you have.
They were limit down today. I was talking to the broker and noticed that. And interesting. Didn't know why.
That's because the producers, they basically are stuck with these cattle. They cannot get them processed, and feed prices are skyrocketing. So input costs in the cattle keep going up. The cattle prices have not kept up with that. And when you have these choke points where these, we only process our meat through basically a handful of these large industrial meat processors in the country now. And so while retail prices will go up, wholesale price, it actually can destroy supply. I mean, it's a very interesting situation. It's really bad for the long term. If it continues for any period of time, it's bad. But the farmers, the ranchers that take on this huge risk to raise the cattle, input costs going way up, and then the timing really matters. And basically because it's all just in time. So bringing to the market, they can just the difference between them making money or losing money on their herd could be a week of extra feed. So.
Yeah, it's really quite serious. And if you're a person, and there are people like that out there that wants to create chaos in the world, and I can think of a number of groups of people that want to create chaos for a number of reasons, this is a great way to do it. I mean, things that are not being watched, but who knows where it ends? I mean,
right?
Yeah,
this is the second.
Bankrupt a bunch of farmers.
Yeah,
knock-on effects from that.
Right, and this is the second major one of these, cyber attacks in the last month. We had the Colonial Pipeline going up to the Northeast, which resolved itself in a week or so. Hopefully, this resolves itself in a week or so again. But it just shows you how fragile it all is, and how reliant, are giant for the global economy, basically, to be reliant on these couple of choke points where, basically someone hijacked someone's computer system and all of a sudden they are, they can't slaughter cattle anymore. I mean, like it's amazing actually how fragile it is.
Yeah, I think there are thousands of choke points out there that are vulnerable. And, the bad guys are seeing that and taking advantage of it.
Now, the question is, who are the bad guys? Because if I'm going to be conspiracy minded with this, you mentioned Klaus Schwab earlier. They had but I think they called it Polygon 2020 last year, where they talked about a cyber pandemic, where these cyber attacks on critical infrastructure would occur. And we've seen some dry runs of that, it seems like.
Yeah, I'm actually coming around more to a conspiracy point of view. I've always poo-pooed conspiracies using the example that, hey, it's hard enough to get 3 or 4 friends to decide on what movie to see and what restaurant to go to afterwards. I mean, how much harder is it to get hundreds of professional rich miscreants to decide on something? But it all seems so synchronized, all this type of thing.
Yeah. And JBS is a partner in the World Economic Forum. I mean, I don't know. I guess everybody is, might not mean anything, but anyway, so let's go to the second article you shared with me. It was about Germany, after years of discussions with Namibia, agreeing to pay some reparations for the genocide they say that they committed in Namibia between 1908 and 1913, I believe it was.
Yeah. Okay. So colonial powers, when they're conquering a primitive country, wind up killing a lot of people that resist them. Okay. So that's unfortunate. But how do you make that right? Okay. And how far back do you go? Should the Vikings pay reparations to Anglo-Saxons for the invasions in the 9th and 10th centuries? I mean, how far back do you want to take this? And I mean, should the British pay reparations to the Irish for alleged misdeeds starving the country back in the 19th century? Well, maybe. So maybe we should take that to court too. I can think of absolutely everywhere. I mean, it's going to go to, should white Americans, this is natural, pay indemnities to Native Americans for what amounted to mostly an accidental genocide. I mean, carried smallpox and other viruses that they weren't immune to from Europe. I mean, where does this end, quite frankly? And anyway, I didn't do it. I don't want to pay reparations for what somebody else did. To hell with that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a basic argument for what's fundamentally flawed about so many of our systems, though. I mean, I personally was not a signer to the Constitution. So I feel like, why am I opted into the U.S., hegemony of Earth? I mean, like, I didn't agree to this contract. So you could take this back, this applies to lots of things. Like if you are not, are we responsible for our actions? Should we be subject to the agreements that we make, the commitments that we make, or should we be responsible for, the decisions of people centuries ago and the commitments that they made thousands or hundreds of years ago, and how we live our lives today? And I think that we aren't responsible or should be committed to obligations that were made by people that aren't us.
Well, and I don't know where this all started. It's an aberration in human psychology, but maybe one of the roots is that quote in Genesis where Yahweh asks Cain, "Where is Abel?" And he says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And of course, what these people have done is they say, "Well, do you want to be like the bad guy Cain and not be your brother's keeper?" Well, the answer is no, you're not. But you're not supposed to be your brother's keeper, but you're not supposed to kill him either. These are two totally separate things that are being conflated.
Right, exactly. Right. Yeah. That's how these things get twisted. You don't want to be like Cain, but he's not really responsible for his brother. Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Just don't kill him. It doesn't mean that you also have to maintain him. So
right.
But so I don't think anybody should be paying reparations to anybody. And of course, blacks, or some blacks, I should say, are looking for white people or somebody, I don't know, it must be white people, or the US government, which isn't the same thing as white people, but they want the US government to give them a whole bunch of money now because, it's crazy. But actually, America is the best thing by far, by 2 orders of magnitude that's ever happened to Black people, quite frankly. And even the invasions of Africa by various white colonialists, it would have been better for the colonialists as well as for the Blacks to, you didn't have to invade. All you had to do was trade with these people. You give them glass beads and trade for whatever at their level of civilization would have made sense. And you didn't have to invade and kill these people. It just led to all kinds of other problems. But still, all told, the Europeans were the best thing that ever happened to the Africans. Because as I've said for years, when Da Gama rounded the Cape, if he'd just thrown out a wheel to the Africans, it would have been a gigantic improvement in their civilization. But he probably would have had to have thrown out an instruction book on how to use it, and they couldn't read either. So this whole thing is screwed up from top to bottom.
Well, and the same is true in with the Native Americans too, right? I mean, the wheel was not something that they had here either, right? Is that correct?
No, they didn't. They didn't have the wheel. They didn't have metal. I mean, it was a Paleolithic civilization, or not even a real civilization, quite frankly. And I know everybody's supposed to idealize the Native Americans. I mean, Disney made a movie called Pocahontas where, they're the good guys and the white guys are the bad guys and all this type of thing. But it's nonsense. I mean, different groups of people, you get them together, and the first they do is they fight, just like the monkeys around the watering hole in 2001, Space Odyssey. It's been that way. And unfortunately, I don't think it's going to change until we evolve out of being advanced chimpanzees. Yeah. Maybe that'll happen in the future. Possible.
So hope so. Yeah, the romanticized view of the Native Americans is interesting because that's the way I was sort of brainwashed, indoctrinated through my public education was that Native Americans were good and peaceful, and then you start to read more about like the Comanche Indians, like what they would do to other tribes, and it's like the brutalization of each other was shocking, was pretty shocking. So it's like you just it's definitely a splash of cold water on that myth of peaceful, nature loving tribesmen, I guess. So
yeah, look, any time an advanced civilization meets a primitive civilization, the outcome is pretty inevitable. What's going to happen? I mean, the only way to solve it, I think, is with property rights. But unfortunately, most of the Indians didn't really have property rights. I mean, the continent was so big, you didn't really keep the roughest kind of property rights. So it's like almost an insoluble problem.
Well, and we might just kind of finish this up on a total out of left field thing, is that we might be experiencing this soon, according to the Pentagon, in relation to UFOs and an alien species who seems to be much more advanced than us, as the Pentagon is set to release this report any day now with all the unclassified information they have on all these UFOs. So who knows? We may experience what.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Personally, I mean, nobody knows. Well, maybe at this point the Pentagon knows, but it makes sense to me that life being what it is, there are probably thousands or millions or tens of millions of other civilizations elsewhere, just in the galaxy. Forget about the fact that there are hundreds of billions of other galaxies as big as this one. So yeah, of course they're out there. And maybe someday we'll be invaded by a strange life form. Maybe they'll be friendly and benevolent, or maybe they'll be like we might be if we invaded a planet. We want stuff, we'll take it. So yeah, entirely possible.
Yep. Do you think this? What do you think though about all? I don't know if you've seen these Pentagon reports. Where they have like some radar confirmation of these craft swarming. With some
I've seen those.
Destroyers. Like it's weird though. Like if they have the idea of the Roswell thing that happened 60 years ago, and then there's like total secrecy, denial of everything, and then now all of a sudden it's an admission that there's something that they're not saying what it is, but there's something, and that they have captured materials that are not of this world is what they have confirmed. Like that's out already. So like it's weird to me that all of a sudden this seems like it's being rolled out, and I'm not, I don't know. Again, a conspiracy minded person. I'm just like, it's just strange.
Well, it's odd that Paul Krugman, who's not an apologist, but he is he's not an economist, but he is a political apologist. Several years ago, he said, in order to get things going again, maybe we should announce an alien invasion to get the economy going again.
Exactly.
Who the hell knows what's going on with these people?
I have no idea, but I mean, this report could come out as soon as today. So once it does, I got to check it out.
That's exciting, but I'm surprised that there hasn't been a lot more flapping of the jaws by the talking heads about this. If it happens, it's the biggest thing that'll have ever happened in all of human history.
Exactly.
But I don't see anybody talking about it. At least the stuff that I read, I haven't seen much other than an acknowledgement.
Yeah, it's still in the background. I think it still feels like such fringe stuff, even though, like I said, they have a Pentagon confirming it. And so that's the difference. And, but what makes me suspicious is, and I'm a suspicious person, but it's like, if the aliens were showing up here, I don't think the Pentagon would be coordinating their PR, the information about their release. I'm pretty sure they would just show up. We would just see them, instead of it being the Pentagon's rolling out like some PR strategy, exactly what's happening over time.
Well, the Pentagon and the military they're about the only trusted institutions left in American life. But even then, I don't think anybody really trusts the Pentagon, and very justifiably.
That's true.
So
they're the last one. So if there was going to be one that's trusted, you're right, it would be them.
Probably. Well, I don't know what other institution of the U.S. government do people trust. But you can't trust them because, as it turns out, there are a lot of generals today that have woke views, including the Secretary of Defense, who is, the fish rots from the head down. And what's happening is the generals are turning political and woke, and they want to get, there seems to be a real effort to get rid of Republicans in the ranks. And this is permeating all through society.
Yeah, Republicans everywhere. In fact, I think that's the goal. As we said earlier, that congressman's tweet that said, "Fact, we just eliminated all Republicans, we'd have all this cornucopia of wonderful things in America." And I really feel like that's is a pervasive idea within the military too. So as you mentioned before we got on the call, there was the drumming out of this. It was a colonel or lieutenant colonel, some high level guy in Space Force, because he was complaining about the creeping cultural Marxism that he was seeing within the ranks.
Yes, and the fact that he notices this and says something about it in public, and then he's dismissed for making an observation, which is actually backed, as far as I can tell. No, it's everywhere, quite frankly. And I'm sorry that once again we come to gloomy conclusions, because I've been reading our friend Marin Katusa's new book called The Rise of America. And I'm very disappointed in the book for many, many reasons. We could review it. I don't know if you've gotten a copy of it yet or not.
I have, and I've started reading it myself. I'm only about 60 pages into it, and I'm looking for something to hold on to, like something, some piece of information that provides a compelling reason why America will rise.
I'm almost through with the book. And the only thing that I can find why America is going to rise is Americans are more entrepreneurial than Europeans, and we're going to get modern monetary theory first, which is actually going to seal the fate of America and destroy it totally. So I don't know what the hell Marin's doing with this book.
We'll have to ask him. We should have him on the show and ask him about it, actually. We should. Yes. Listen, we're way behind on guests. We've talked about Dave Henderson in New Zealand and Leon Lowe in South Africa and Gary North here and Rick Rule and Marin. So I guess we have to amp up our interviewer. Get our butts of gear. Yeah. I'll get on that, and I'll finish Marin's book, and I'll talk to him to see if we can get him on the show, and we can have him, because he is brilliant. I mean, Marin is a brilliant guy. I mean, it must be missing something. So
absolutely. And when it comes to picking resource stocks, he's really just a superstar. So I don't know what the hell was going on in his mind. Well, we'll find out after we both finish the book. But yeah, I was saying to myself, what am I missing here? What's the reason why America is going to rise, other than Marin thinks so? Thanks for your opinion, Marin, but I'm looking for more.
Yeah, we'll have to ask him. So, okay, we'll leave it there for now. I'll work on finishing that book, and we'll get him lined up as to come on the show and talk about it, because that'll be fun.
That's fantastic. All right. Well, talk to you very soon, Matt.
Right. Yes.